All right. Well, thank you for having me here. Let me put this up. My name is Todd Helmus. I'm a senior behavioral scientist at the RAND Corporation. I've been doing extremism work for the last, 20 years or so, starting with Al Qaeda, then ISIS, and now, of course, we have a new threat here in the United States. And I also do a lot of work with the military. I've deployed with the U.S. forces. That sounds a little dramatic, but I've served as a downrange advisor for special operations units in Afghanistan, as well as advising the 4-star command in Iraq. So I sort of know a little bit of both sides of this story. So happy to talk to you about some of my observations. Well, there's a flag with some soldiers with a Nazi flag, which is interesting. But first, let me talk about what I really want to talk about today is talk about what we can think about the risk. What is the risk? What are the prevalence rates that we know of regarding extremism in the military and veterans? And then maybe talk a little bit about why that might be. And if there's time, then we can also talk a little bit about some intervention strategies. So obviously, extremism in the military is not a new problem. This goes back to 1865 when the Ku Klux Klan was started by Confederate generals. That's probably not a big surprise. And of course, there's a long-standing history of segregation in U.S. history, and that applied to the military as well, though that doesn't really fall under the rubric of violent extremism, of course. But then I think we were all jarred in January 2021 when reports were suggesting very high rates, sometimes 25%. The initial reports were 25% of those at the Capitol riot were representatives of U.S. military or veterans. And I think that that shocked the Pentagon as well as the rest of society here. Here we can see some of the longer history of extremism in the military. You can go back to 1968 when there was a celebratory parade on a U.S. military base in Vietnam with the killing of Martin Luther King. 1976, there's a KKK chapter established at the Camp Pendleton. There was also indications in the 80s that weapons were getting diverted to some of these groups, and that caused the Pentagon Secretary of Defense, I think Weinberger at the time, to direct new policies. And of course, the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. And then there was also an event, I think 1996, where there was a murder of an African-American couple at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and it was discovered that there was basically a cell of neo-Nazis in the 82nd Airborne, which is a little shocking because it's an elite unit, elite-ish, and that caused the Pentagon to develop a new set of policies. Anyway, so you can see it goes on from there. There were a number of different examples. So there's a lot of like anecdotal reasons to be concerned about this topic. Military personnel represent an ideal recruiting target for extremist groups. We have had conversations with a former leader of the National Socialist Movement named Jeff Shope. He's since reformed and now works to counter violent extremism himself. But as a leader, it was an interesting insight. Number one, they really wanted military people or former military people in their organization. A lot of people talk about the fact that military people have weapons skills and they know how to use weapons, which makes them ideal targets for recruitment. But they're also like disciplined, organized. They can follow rules. And those things I think are probably even more useful. To be honest, there's not that many armed, coordinated right-wing assaults against targets here in the United States. So I think the utility of the weapon skills is probably marginal compared to their organizational skills and discipline that they bring. And so what Jeff told us was, they really realigned their organization to help recruit these guys. They got rid of the Nazi flags that they were flying, and they started flying American flags. And they started chanting USA, USA, and they really tried to, and they really directed recruitment at military personnel. Here we show a plot by CSIS that shows a rise in military associated terror plots. The light blue is the, let's see, the screen gets in my way, is the rise in this shows the relationship between active duty and reserve individuals in extremist plots, and you can see a rise in 2020. So again, another reason to be concerned. There's also a military times survey, I think in 2020, that showed that it's really the only survey data that's of use in this area, which is really disappointing. More than a third of active duty troops and half of minority service members say they've personally witnessed examples of white nationalism or ideologically driven extremism in the service. That's obviously very, very concerning. It's the way the question is answered, though, it's not so helpful. It doesn't give us a prevalence rate of anything. Obviously, there could be a few incidents that drive a lot of those perceptions. So it's enlightening, but it raises probably more questions than it answers. So I think more interesting data come from START. START compiled 461 case studies of individuals with military backgrounds who committed criminal acts motivated by political, social, religious, or economic goals. 461, that seems like a high number. There's a few things that we know about these individuals. One, the 120, which represents about 15% of the participating in the January 6 attacks. So 15% of the January 6 attackers ended up having military affiliations, which is substantially lower than the initial estimates of 25%. The 75 in this 461 sample were active duty at the time that they committed or in active service at the time that they committed these attacks. Most were in the Army and the Marine Corps, relatively few, only 20% were in the Navy and in the Air Force. And half of these included anti-government ideologies. So anyway, a lot of interesting research coming out of START on this. I do think, though, it's important to consider the difference between active military personnel and veterans. If you think about the general statistics, let's see here, where are my numbers here? The U.S. military active duty force is 1.4 million in size. So that's a very large number. It doesn't seem, if we look at the overall trend of attacks, that there is a huge threat coming out of active duty service. We know that there's a lot of anecdotes, examples, case studies of individuals in the active service who have been arrested and charged with committing these attacks or plotting these attacks. So the examples exist. But given that the service is 1.5 million, it's not very high. If you look at only five active duty personnel were, I think, in the January 6 attack. So it's relatively small. If you look at the percentages, this is sort of a terrible way to do math, but active duty personnel make up 0.4% of the US population, and they represented only 0.6% of the attackers in the January 6 attack. In contrast to veterans make up 5% of the US populace, and they represented 15% of the January 30% of all right-wing plots. So there's a big difference, and I think there's a couple reasons why we might see these issues being protected for active duty personnel. Those who are active duty in the military, they live in a very structured, disciplined environment. They work very closely with their coworkers. It's hard to keep secrets, I think, in that environment. It's also an incredibly social environment. Military families are very close together. People in the military are engaged a lot. It's a very social buffering environment. In contrast to being a veteran, right? You go from this environment of super connectivity to now being outside on your own. You sort of not lost your purpose, but you don't have the same purpose that you had when you were in the military. You don't have the same social network that you had when you were in the military. You don't have the same oversight that you had when you were in the military. And I think for that reason, the veterans are particularly, there's reason to think that they're at risk for these types of efforts. The Pentagon policies that have put in a few policies in place, but really not a lot, probably considering what we initially thought with the whole 25% notion at the January 6 attacks. Essentially, I think I'm trying to remember what the policies were, but they put together, there's now warnings, there's now new screening mechanisms to ensure that people who are coming in don't have violent ideological pasts to them. When they leave the military, they are given warnings about the risk of being recruited for violent extremism. And there's been new policies put in place about what military people how they can use social media. And of course, there was a big stand down back in March. The entire Pentagon, the entire Department of Defense spent a day basically huddling and thinking about this violent extremism issue. So the Pentagon is taking steps. I do think, though, it's important to think about what other things the Pentagon has to deal with. Since September 11, 2001, 30,000 people in uniform who have served since then have committed suicide. So compared to the violent extremism problem, the suicide issue is profoundly more concerning. Also, there's about 6.2% rate of sexual assault in the military, which again is very concerning. So, this issue of extremism has a lot of issues to compete with within the Department of Defense. To the extent that they develop policies to address this, those policies will obviously have to fight amidst other issues. Veterans, of course, have also their own issues to deal with, and there is the VA, and I think the VA is looking at what they can do on this issue. Probably the most urgent is for them to identify ways to provide social support to ease the transition from military service to veteranness, and find ways to provide social support where they can. Finally, I'll note that we know very little about prevalence rates overall of ideology, of support for terrorism amidst these efforts. We're working on studies right now to try to reverse that. There's certainly more that the Department of Defense could do to understand what the prevalence rates are within the service, to understand the degree to which right-wing any extremist attitudes are tolerated at the unit level. So with that, I'll pause and look forward to questions in a little bit.